Konami stands as one of the most prolific publishers in gaming. From its 16-bit classics to its more experimental 32-bit titles, the red and orange Konami logo long stood as a seal of quality. But even among its vast catalog, there is no series that has grabbed the attention of millions quite like Metal Gear Solid. On this episode of DF Retro, we're going to look back at one of the most impressive yet divisive installments in the franchise, Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. So join me as we look back at everything from the earliest available media, the original E3 trailer, the final game, and comparison with the various ports available. Let's get started. The year was 1998, and the release schedule was packed with titles that were destined for the history books. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time for Nintendo 64, Half-Life for the PC, the Sega Dreamcast console itself, in Japan at least, and of course, Metal Gear Solid for the original PlayStation. Metal Gear Solid heralded the return of Hideo Kojima to the Metal Gear series, which he helped build in 1987, and introduced millions of gamers to a new style of game, one which weaves stealth action and a cinematic story together seamlessly. A far cry from the barely interactive FMV titles that were big just a few years prior. I remember borrowing a copy of Metal Gear Solid from a friend back in the day. I had just finished Half-Life and didn't expect much from the game, but even with visuals limited by the original PlayStation, it was clear that Metal Gear offered something unique and engaging. I couldn't help but imagine what a game like this might look like on more powerful machines such as the Dreamcast. I could only imagine a sequel. As 1998 ended, Kojima and his team were already hard at work on just that, devising a sequel to their most successful game yet. Kojima completed his first draft of the game's design document in January 1999. The sequel was referred to as Metal Gear Solid 3 or MGS3, the Roman numerals of which referenced the New York skyline. The document lays out ideas for a sequel that would be developed for Sony's still unannounced next-generation console, the PlayStation 2. Kojima envisioned huge numbers of enemies on screen with bodies that remained in the scene, the interaction of light and shadow, physics interactions with real-world objects, multi-tiered environments, and advanced enemy AI. The intent was not to push visuals to the limit, rather to use the processing power of the PlayStation 2 to deliver an enhanced gameplay experience. Once the team had access to early PlayStation 2 development hardware, one of the lead programmers spent weeks experimenting with the new platform in order to better understand just what was possible. But at the same time, the gaming world was heating up. September 1999 brought with it the North American launch of Sega Dreamcast and the official unveiling of PlayStation 2 in Japan. The Dreamcast launched to huge fanfare with a massive selection of impressive titles, but just 6 months later, the PlayStation 2 itself would launch in Japan. The initial batch of games left a lot to be desired in terms of image quality, and many began to doubt whether the system was all it was cracked up to be. Back at Konami, Kojima continued to work diligently on his PlayStation 2 sequel, moving towards an important milestone, the first public reveal. The next Metal Gear would finally be unveiled to the public in May of 2000 at the Electronic Entertainment Expo, and Kojima couldn't have been more nervous. The road to E3 was a challenge. The team worked hard to prepare a trailer, which Kojima himself helped craft. Internal demos give us an idea of what the game looked like prior to this initial reveal, but a lot of work was poured into creating the finished trailer. This trailer would be created from the game engine, rather than pre-rendered, while enemy behavior and scenarios were programmed to behave in a specific fashion for the showing. The staff at Konami's American office were initially skeptical of this 9-minute presentation, as it would eat up a significant chunk of their video roll, and they hadn't even seen the game yet, but Kojima persisted, and the stage was set for the big reveal. the next Metal Gear was about to be unveiled to the world. That date was May 10th, 2000. The location? Universal Studios Theater 1 in Los Angeles, California. Members of the development team and Kojima himself prepared for the unveiling. Kojima had spent the flight trying to memorize a short speech in English, which he would present to the crowd. The audience was ready, the lights dimmed, and Metal Gear Solid 2 was unveiled for the first time.
I stare at the stars and the sky up above.
To say that the resulting trailer was impressive would be a gross understatement. The 9-minute trailer set a new standard in cinematic presentation. Some were skeptical. Was this really a game? How could it look this good? It seems silly in retrospect, but prior to the reveal, Kojima was concerned that his focus on interaction and AI would leave the visuals looking underwhelming next to the competition. There was certainly nothing to be worried about. What stands out about this trailer still today is the way in which it demonstrates the intentions of the developers. Most trailers are either of the purely cinematic variety or simply a lengthy gameplay demo. This original trailer for MGS2, however, attempts to do both. Most sequences demonstrated were focused on highlighting gameplay opportunities from cinematic angles. We could see how things such as real-time shadows would play a role in the stealth system, how physics figured into the combat, and how the enemy AI would react to the player. The scenarios presented in this trailer would not exist in this form in the final game exactly, but all of the gameplay opportunities displayed here certainly did. And all of this was captured from real development hardware. The trailer was displayed at 60 frames per second, but in busy scenes, screen tearing was evident. Beyond that, the game was still rendering at a lower resolution at this point using interlaced field rendering, which resulted in some obvious jaggies and flickering, something that would be addressed in the final game with a bump in resolution. So yes, there was doubt at this time, but looking back, it's clear that everything on display was generated by the game engine. Now, there were sections in the demo which didn't make the final cut, of course. The trailer finishes up with Snake escaping from the tanker as it explodes around him, for instance. This does not occur in the final game, and it's likely due to the realization that making such a sequence simply wasn't fun. The same goes for some of the outlandish ideas outlined in the original design document. Kojima specifies scenes in which hundreds of soldiers would be on screen at once, but would anyone really want to fight that many enemies in this game, even if it were feasible? So over the next few days in May 2000, the demo continued to play at Konami's booth, drawing a tremendous crowd at all times. At a show when most of Sony's booth was focused on playing DVD copies of The Matrix, this game really stood out and single-handedly contributed to the rising hype for PlayStation 2's upcoming release in North America. The show was a smashing success, and Kojima returned home proud of what they had achieved. But it's from this point where development kicked into high gear. The next major milestone would be the completion of a playable demo. A demo which would be released alongside another KCET game in development, Zone of the Enders. Directed by Noriaki Okamura and produced by Kojima himself, Zone of the Enders was one of the first major Konami products released for PlayStation 2. And to help sell the game, a playable demo of Metal Gear Solid 2 was set to be included. The demo itself contains the first portion of the tanker chapter, up until the defeat of Olga. Players are given free reign of the tanker up until this point, which helped prove that everything that had been shown prior was very much real. More importantly, the demo demonstrated just how much potential the gameplay itself had. While the path through the demo was highly linear, the levels were designed as mini sandboxes of sorts with a tremendous amount of interactivity. Metal Gear Solid is about freedom within a linear framework, and nothing illustrates this better than the tanker sequence in Metal Gear Solid 2. So were there any differences between the demo and the final version then? Well, there are a couple things. For one thing, the sound during the introduction sequence was changed for the final game, and certain sound effects play back differently. Take a listen. The codec screen was also improved in the final version, with better looking character models and interface placement. Still, the demo did feel very polished when you consider that it was completed a full year before the final game. Following this demo, MGS2 would make its next appearance at E3 2001, with another brilliant trailer. It's at this point where Kojima's plan to hide the game's true main character until release really kicked into overdrive. We'll talk about Raiden shortly, but at this stage, only those close to the development team knew of the character. As of E3, nobody working for Konami of America had even heard the name Raiden. But if most of the game contained the new character, then what could you show at E3? The original trailers had already showcased most of the areas where Snake would be playable in the final game after all. To show new content then, without revealing the secret, Kojima opted to include fake sequences in the trailer. Snake was shown battling Fortune, for instance, or engaging a jet on the Washington Bridge. With the narrative dealing with things such as the manipulation of digital information, this deception fits right into the themes of the game in a way. It was certainly a bold move and one that I enjoyed, but some fans would feel betrayed by this in the final game. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. It was a great trailer as usual, but the trailer ended with the text, "MGS submerges." Marketing-wise, this helps build up excitement for the final product, but ultimately the message was genuine. Kojima and team were starting to believe that it might be impossible to finish the game for release in 2001. The team crunched hard all summer, even requesting a week extension to hit the release date. The game would need to be finished by September 14th, 2001 in order to be ready for manufacturing. Of course, the infamous September 11th attack threw a wrench into the works and forced the team to make slight modifications to the ending of the game, which involved Arsenal gear slamming into Manhattan. But even still, the game was indeed finished on time and sent off for duplication just as planned. It was a difficult development cycle, but ultimately, things went by quickly when considering the scope of the game. It was created in less than 2 years after all. While the Japanese and European versions were still being worked on at this point, the game was now ready to launch in North America on November 12th, 2001, just as planned. I was there on day one. I arrived at a local game shop where a friend of mine worked on a Monday evening. The game was set to be on shelves that Tuesday, but the manager drove out to the airport to pick up the shipment himself. He pulled up around 7 p.m. with copies of the game ready to sell. I grabbed my copy, drove back home, and prepared for the unexpected.
What?
The result was certainly a roller coaster. From the unexpected reveal of Raiden to the crazy story and interesting gameplay scenarios, it was a very memorable experience. Some fans felt betrayed by the surprise reveal of Raiden, of course, while others were floored by the bait and switch. It was certainly a unique game. For this video then, I want to look at the key elements which help define the gameplay and the visuals on display. And that begins with the lengthy introduction. The scene is set with expertly framed shots of the George Washington Bridge. A pouring rainstorm helps build atmosphere before the camera zooms down to focus on a poncho-cloaked Solid Snake finishing off a cigarette. The entire sequence is rendered in real time by the PlayStation 2. And one of the key pillars in the visual design of the game is its reliance on post-processing effects such as depth of field and motion blur. Kojima had already tested something similar in the original Metal Gear Solid, but these effects were limited on the original PlayStation. With the PlayStation 2, however, the development team was able to achieve much more realistic results. Looking back, these motion captured sequences still hold up well today, with smooth animation and excellent camera work throughout. The effects work used in certain key sequences also remains impressive. When Snake slams into the deck of the ship, his optical camo shorts out due to the landing impact. The associated lighting and particles then look absolutely stunning in motion. Now if we pause and examine the scene more closely, it starts to become easier to understand how it was created. You can see the warping effect applied to Snake, while streaks of blue light emanate from his position. The background is out of focus in the scene, and exposure is increased to give the streaks of electricity around his model an increased level of brightness. Every time the camera cuts, real-time lights are adjusted to match the scene. When we cut to Ocelot in the chopper, for instance, we see a nice orange hue along his character model. If we zoom out though, we can see that the chopper was only partially constructed for this scene, but really what we're looking for is Snake over here on the tanker. You'll notice that he too has an orange glow now because of the light source enabled just for the Ocelot scene. When the scene cuts back to Snake naturally then, this orange hue is absent. The scene helps demonstrate how the game's cutscenes are assembled. Typically, most of these scenes consist of bits and pieces floating within a larger space. To avoid loading, the game breaks up objects into smaller chunks with just the amount of geometry necessary for the scene based on camera placement. This prevents the scenes from growing too large and eating into the performance budget, no doubt. While we're discussing cutscenes, I wanted to look at another great moment later in the game which highlights this technique in action. When the plant is sinking as Arsenal gear is unleashed, the camera jumps between many different locations. Each area exists within this one scene, but it only presents what is necessary. One of the most impressive bits remains this, the rushing water down the hallway. We can even pause the scene now and fly around within the particles. Yes, the frame rate absolutely crashes down here, but it's amazing to see just how many particles were used to pull this off. Interestingly, this water escape sequence was teased in one of the older trailers as well, revealing again that Kojima was considering some sort of escape sequence. Okay, so back to the beginning. Once the cutscenes play out and the player is handed control, you can begin to explore the tanker and get a feel for what the team has achieved. The first thing to note here is the resolution and frame rate. Unlike the initial trailer, which was field rendered, Metal Gear Solid 2 uses a full frame buffer setup on the PS2 and runs at 512 by 448. If you use something like the HD loader on your PS2, it's even possible to force the game to run in progressive scan. But the key to its fluidity lies in the frame rate. Metal Gear Solid 2 runs at 60 frames per second during gameplay and looks incredible in motion as a result. You must remember that at this point, 60 FPS for 3D games was still relatively new on consoles. The Dreamcast ushered in the era of 60 FPS, true, but this was typically reserved for more arcade-style titles. Metal Gear Solid 2 was one of the first big-budget action-adventure games to deliver such a high frame rate on this scale with this level of visual splendor. One of the first elements which really stands out here is the rain, an effect which still holds up today and was light years beyond anything else on the market in 2001. MGS2 uses a variety of different particles here in tandem, while varying velocity and direction to simulate wind. When the player enters first person, water droplets also form on the screen, and these droplets distort light passing through them, while also moving about realistically. Particles are then applied to the surface of the characters and the ship's surface alike to give the impression of rain pouring onto its surface. All of this is accentuated by the apparent use of reflections. Scene reflections play a huge role in the visual makeup of the game, in fact, with indoor and outdoor scenes alike making heavy use of this. Outdoors we see the effect applied to the soaking wet deck of the ship, but indoors the shiny floors use the same trick. Of course, in practice the effect is rather simple. The team places simplified mirrored geometry below the surface while using an alpha texture to give the impression of a solid floor. It's rather convincing and genuinely gives the impression that surfaces are reflecting. Character models are of course mirrored as well. The PS2 afforded the team enough resources to pull this off without impacting performance. This same trick is used for other effects throughout the game as well. The specular highlight, for instance, used on large bodies of water, is faked using a texture placed below the surface. And it looks pretty convincing, I think. Heck, even mirrors work using this same trick. Character models standing in front of a mirror are fully reflected. While we're talking about character models, Metal Gear Solid 2 makes use of relatively low poly models compared to many other PS2 titles of this era. While games such as Onimusha or Jak 2 featured characters with upwards of 10,000 polygons, MGS2 was generally around or below 4,000 polygons for main characters. Lesser NPCs then would consist of even fewer triangles. Despite this, the end results looked great. It was the smart texturing, good shading, and smooth animation that helped work around these limitations. The environments themselves were also reasonably detailed, but benefit greatly from the segmented design. Like many other titles of this era, each map was divided by a short loading screen, which made it possible to push details beyond what would have been possible on a larger scale. What makes both aspects so impressive is how attractive and sharp everything looks even today when blown up to higher resolutions. The art direction is strong enough to overcome any of these limitations, and the end result is a sharp, beautiful looking game even now. Another neat feature that is immediately evident from the beginning is the ability to shoot out lights. Take out a light, and you can even disable the light source in some scenes. And while this trick didn't wind up being used heavily in gameplay, it definitely adds something to the mix. This spotlight here, for instance, casts a nice long shadow across the scene. Shoot out the light though, and the shadow is eliminated. Speaking of shadows, just as in the original trailer, these do play into gameplay, while also just looking plain cool. Enemies and the player characters can all cast dynamic shadows. In this early hallway sequence here, for instance, while Snake is leaning out, his shadow spills into the scene, revealing his location to the enemy. The reverse can also be true, of course. Even your handgun flashlight can cast shadows. They even use this trick to play with player expectations. Vulcan Raven? Nope, just a shadow of a small action figure. Neat. And how about these little particles that he's shooting out? They sort of bounce around and collect on the floor realistically. The game even makes use of fake light shafts when dealing with flashlight-equipped enemies. It appears to be a relatively simple technique with geometry extruded from the character giving the impression of light shafts, but it looks convincing all the same. And while the real-time shadows are certainly important in the game, MGS2 makes heavy use of baked shadows as well. This is purely here for artistic reasons and definitely adds a sense of depth to the environment. Of course, a lot of the lighting and shadows are baked in this game, but when everything comes together, the team was able to create scenes that look incredibly realistic. This hallway is a great example. The use of reflections, lighting, and textures help create a surprisingly natural and realistic looking area for a game of this vintage. That's not to say that more dynamic shadows don't make an appearance. During the battle with Fortune, for instance, the overhead lights can wobble back and forth as she destroys the environment around you. When that happens, the shadows cast from crates and other objects in the room below move accordingly. It's a convincing effect to be sure. And this is a pretty interesting battle in general. The heavy use of particles really brings the PS2 to its knees, and it looks really impressive in motion. Unfortunately, it also exhibits some of the most severe slowdown in the game. Some other neat things you'll notice once indoors. If you were out in the rain too long, Snake develops a sneeze, which can alert enemies to your presence if they're around. Oh, and Snake even leaves footprints when walking through puddles of water or blood, two more elements that enemies can track. Then we have the level of interaction on display. This lounge area aboard the ship is a perfect example of this. You can start by shooting at the plants, causing the leaves to move about, or you can destroy the TV and take out the magazines. If you put enough rounds into this giant piece of glass then, it shatters beautifully, which in turn results in glass shards that create noise as you walk across them. If you break this glass on your way to Olga, it will still be broken when you return later on. Or how about the bottles in this scene? You can shoot every bottle, and each bottle has multiple breakpoints designed to coincide with where you shoot them. Oh, and how could I not mention the ice cubes? Knock over this bucket here and the individual ice cubes spill out. If you sit and watch, they will slowly disappear, or more appropriately, melt. It's not just on this tanker where you encounter such details either. In the plant chapter, for instance, you can enter a bathroom early on with a mirror. While shooting the mirror, it breaks apart in realistic chunks based on your shot location. And there are plenty of other small details like this that exist across the entire game. None of these things are required, and many players will wind up missing such details, but it all fits within Kojima's original desire to simulate a world rather than just design a bunch of maps. Steam pipes burst when shot, fire extinguishers explode and even help in revealing traps, pieces of fruit break up into chunks when shot, computer terminals sizzle under gunfire, and bags of flour spill their contents when shot. Everything feels interactive to some degree. Then we have the AI. Enemies were designed to behave in a way that is fun to engage with. The way in which enemies track and deal with the player is interesting to watch unfold, and while the enemies are reactive enough when engaged in an actual firefight, it's when you first lose them that it becomes so much fun. This game of cat and mouse is often highlighted by using a picture-in-picture window in the upper right corner of the screen. The game regularly communicates what the AI is seeing and gives you a chance to respond. Watching enemies clear a room or search through lockers adds a lot of tension to every scene. Enemies even communicate via walkie-talkies. If a lone enemy spots you and you deal with him or his radio before he has a chance to radio in, you might escape a full alert status. Of course, if a soldier fails to report in, the commander will send troops to that location. And since bodies do not disappear in this game, even when moving between loading screens, you need to move and hide them yourself to avoid an alert status. At the time, this level of granularity was simply unheard of. Oh, and another neat detail when dealing with bodies is the way in which Snake or Raiden carefully steps over fallen enemies. Or the way Raiden slips on bird droppings, if we're talking about movement. Yeah. Truthfully though, it's almost impossible to cover every detail on display in this game. The development team did an incredible job here simulating a world, and the attention to detail really stands out even now. And while we're here, I want to take a moment to discuss some of the ending sequences. Not the story itself, rather, the way in which the game toys with the player. Playing this back in 2001, Metal Gear Solid 2 may have been the first game I had ever played, which truly left me wondering what the heck was happening. When the plant sinks into the ocean as Arsenal Gear rises, Raiden is captured and stripped naked. The following narrative scene recalls a torture scene from the original Metal Gear Solid, but once you're free, things kinda jump off the deep end. While trying to figure out how to escape from this area with no weapons and while naked, the Colonel will continuously call you using the codec, and everything he has to say is, well, like this.
I hear it's amazing when the famous purple stuffed worm in Flapjaw Space with the tuning fork does a raw blink on Harry Carey Rock. I need scissors. 61.
Then, once you reach the adjacent tunnel, this happens. The player is trapped in the tunnel momentarily with no obvious escape, the codec calls keep coming, and you're left in a state of confusion. Eventually, Snake will make a proper return with your gear in tow and the game can continue, but wow. And it's true, some players did not enjoy this sequence, but personally I love the feeling of not knowing what a developer has in store. MGS2 was not afraid to flip the table, so to speak. Messing with expectations in this way is something we just don't see often in big games today.
Long, long ago, there were a man who tried to make his skill ultimate. Because of his bloody life, it's no accident that he was involved in the Troubles. What?
But it's something to relish when it does appear. Between sequences such as this, Raiden's unexpected starring role, and some of the other narrative choices, it becomes clear why this was a divisive game. But I still feel that these aspects are to be commended. The bait and switch with Raiden is especially amazing. The fact that Kojima and his team were able to keep this secret right up into the launch of the game in North America is pretty crazy when you think about it. It's the kind of secret that no AAA publisher would ever dream of allowing today. And that kinda goes for just about all the craziness in Metal Gear Solid 2, really. It goes places most other AAA games would never dare. Still, if you look beyond the divisive story, Metal Gear Solid 2 presents a level of detail, fluidity, and interactivity that stood above any other game released in 2001. It was a landmark achievement from a technical and gameplay standpoint, and one that still amazingly holds up today, despite the rather convoluted controls. But the Metal Gear Solid 2 train would not stop in 2001. Beyond the Japanese and European releases, MGS2 would be released on multiple additional platforms. First up was the Xbox version, a long-rumored release that would appear just 1 year after the original. Known as Metal Gear Solid 2 Substance, this updated version of the game added new content and features to the mix while simultaneously bringing the game to Microsoft's new console. Unfortunately, this version of the game is simply mediocre. The engine was clearly designed for PlayStation 2 and doesn't take great advantage of the hardware. It also suffers from a host of new problems not present in the original. In general, the issues with this version of the game can be broken down into 4 different areas: performance, texture quality, visual quality, and control. But let's start with the most egregious of problems: the texture work. It becomes clear early on that there is something slightly off about the texture work in this version. Everything has a grungy, dirty appearance compared to the original, and when we bring in the PS2 version, it becomes clear that the textures on Xbox exhibit noticeable color banding that is a lot less noticeable on the PS2. Just look at the wall here. So, what's going on? My theory is that this issue stems from the conversion process. You see, PlayStation 2 games made use of a specific 8-bit palletized texture format, sometimes with an alpha channel, which wasn't directly supported by the more modern GPU in the Xbox. In porting the game, these art assets would need to be converted to a format supported by the Xbox then, and it seems that the conversion process introduced this problem. The result is dirty looking textures throughout the game. YouTube does help mask the problem to a degree, but while you're playing, the difference is clear and the game just doesn't look quite as nice on the Xbox. The next major issue centers on performance. Unfortunately, while we cannot analyze analog video capture when it has screen tearing issues, it's pretty clear that the average frame rate drops pretty hard in the more complex sequences. Frame skipping is not used in the game, so when performance drops below the target, gameplay speed is impacted, which makes getting around certain areas on Xbox slower, and of course the game feels less responsive overall when it's slowing down. This problem manifests in the cutscenes as well, which do not play back as smoothly as they do on PlayStation 2. Then there's the effects work. The original game makes heavy use of post-processing and particles, designed with the fill rate of PlayStation 2 in mind. The Xbox conversion doesn't quite match the original in a number of areas, though the differences are often subtle. For instance, the lack of depth of field here in this scene. Or the massive reduction in quality of the effect when Snake lands on the tanker. Even the motion blur effect isn't quite right. The way in which this blur interacts with foreground elements leads to some subtle artifacts. As we move the camera around here in the rain, you can see visible splotches left behind in the empty space of the image. Something we don't see on PlayStation 2. Then we have the control. The Xbox pad was a revelation for first-person shooters, but Metal Gear Solid 2, with its convoluted control scheme, doesn't map particularly well to the Xbox controller. Now, the pressure-sensitive function is at least retained, so it's possible to draw a weapon and carefully let off the X button without firing a shot. But going into first-person view is now a toggle assigned to the left analog stick. It works well enough, but it's not optimal and can make certain actions more difficult. There's also problems when trying to shimmy around walls and corners. The game simply doesn't feel quite right on the Xbox pad, since it was clearly designed with the 4 shoulder button configuration of the DualShock 2. Still, despite these issues, the Xbox port is not actually bad. It's simply disappointing when you consider how capable the Xbox is. Even the lackluster port of Silent Hill 2 managed to include a per-pixel flashlight cone on Xbox, which is an improvement over the PS2 original there. MGS2 though is pretty much a downgrade across the board. Well, okay, it does feature Dolby Digital Audio, something in which is also present on PS2, but restricted to exactly 3 cutscenes, so, Unfortunately, like Silent Hill 2, the Xbox port only makes use of Dolby Digital 4.0 during gameplay, so there's no center channel or subwoofer action here. Still, 4 discrete channels are certainly better than 2, so it's an improvement. The game also runs at a slightly higher resolution. It jumps from 512 pixels wide on PS2 to 640 on Xbox. It also natively supports progressive scan, which is only possible on PlayStation 2 when using homebrew or third-party software. Ultimately, the Xbox version is more of a curiosity today than a great way to revisit the game, but it is an interesting port. The extra content in this version of the game then would soon make its way back to PlayStation 2 as well, so you could enjoy it with the original visual quality. The PS2 version also features the Snake skateboarding demo based on Konami's Evolution skateboarding engine, which is a neat bonus only available in that version of the game. The PS2 version also makes the jump to a dual-layer DVD, which has the unfortunate side effect of slightly increasing loading times. Just a couple of weeks after the PS2 release of Substance, the PC received its own port of the game, and, well, there were some problems with it out of the gate. That might be putting it mildly even. Metal Gear Solid 2 for the PC is not a good port. But revisiting it today, there is at least a way to greatly improve the experience thanks to a fan-made patch. But let's start with the fully patched official version first. Now, I had to jump through a lot of hoops to get it running on a modern operating system, but even then, the end results are pretty underwhelming. So what happens when you try to play it on a modern graphics card then? Well, the first problem is that most of the post-processing effects are either completely absent or simply broken. These introduction cutscenes really demonstrate the issue nicely. Background elements that were originally concealed by depth of field, for instance, are now laid bare before you with zero image treatment. Other effects, such as cloth or the bungee cord used in the introduction, also display improperly on the PC and look rather choppy compared to the original game. Sure, the resolution is higher and performance is now very stable on a modern PC, but this isn't how Metal Gear Solid 2 is supposed to look. The cinematic presentation of the original is compromised here. I could see some people preferring the presentation without these effects in place, and that's fine, but that doesn't mean that what's here isn't broken. Of course, this is a very, very sensitive port, so with the right legacy graphics card, it's entirely possible that it could look much more accurate to the original game. You're just not going to get that on a modern GPU. Now, once you get in the game, things start to look a little better. It's still missing all of the post-processing effects, of course, but it runs well and it looks closer to the original game, especially once you step indoors. Still, the art design suffers here. Stripping away all of those effects while increasing the resolution allows you to focus on the shortcomings of the visuals and produces something that just doesn't feel quite right. That said, it is still better than what Radeon owners got back in the day. I first played this on an ATI Radeon 9700 Pro, the hottest ATI graphics card in the market at the time. And Metal Gear Solid 2 didn't really work properly at all. I don't have any video footage, but these screenshots do demonstrate the issue. Pretty ugly, right? Another major issue with this port are the controls. The keyboard controls feel terrible, and no amount of configuration can produce something that plays as it should. Gamepad support is lousy as well, and button mappings are wrong on modern pads. Basically, in the default form, it's nearly impossible to play it. So between the ugly visuals and the bad controls, clearly this is not a great way to play the game. But late last year, a user over on Reddit put together a patch designed to address these faults, and you know what? They did a very nice job. Straight away, higher resolutions are supported, including widescreen resolutions, and the configuration program is easier to use. Modern controllers now work, and the game becomes much easier to enjoy as a result. The visuals during the cutscenes are certainly improved. Some of the post-processing effects are still dialed back compared to the original PS2 game, but it is a nice jump over the stock version of the game on modern GPUs. Also keep in mind that some of the effects can appear differently based on your resolution settings. Some aspects are still broken though. The color filters are off-centered in some scenes, while the same goes for the visor overlay in others. The same can be said of the in-game visuals. Everything just looks much closer to how it should. So between the improved visuals, the support for higher resolutions, and now perfect performance, it's really not a bad way to play. Though, while the addition of widescreen support is nice, it can also introduce a few glitches around the edges of maps, so keep that in mind. But really, if you want to play Metal Gear Solid 2 on the PC, there's an even better way. Emulation. PCSX2 might just be the right solution for you. With minimal configuration, it's possible to run the game almost flawlessly. You'll need a beefy PC, sure, but it can look absolutely wonderful. All of the original PS2 visuals are fully intact, and performance is in many scenes even faster. Not only that, you can configure the controls as you please, making this one of the best ways to revisit Metal Gear Solid 2 today. That said, I did run into a couple of minor glitches at points. This specific scene with Olga, for instance, exhibited rendering artifacts, and it's possible that certain elements might not work right later in the game, but for the most part, it looks great. You can even just pop the DVD version of the game right into your PC, if you still have an optical drive, and it plays great off the disc. Of course, if you run from an ISO, it loads even faster. But there is another official way to enjoy the game at a higher resolution. In late 2011, 10 years after the release of Metal Gear Solid 2, Bluepoint and Konami released the Metal Gear Solid HD Collection. Metal Gear Solid 2, of course, makes up 1/3 of the package. And it's fair to say that the HD version of the game is quite good. The visual effects are preserved, the performance is overwhelmingly excellent, and the game feels great to play. Bluepoint opted to preserve rather than enhance visual effects, so none of the core artwork has been changed, but at the same time it hasn't been reduced in quality either like we saw on Xbox. The one exception is the interface itself. All of the text and UI elements were recreated at a higher resolution and are very crisp in action. It's a very nice improvement. That said, when you do compare it against the original PS2 version, there is a sense that the art isn't completely one-to-one here. There's a difference in color between the two in certain scenes, for instance, and effects that are dependent on resolution look somewhat less impressive in HD. So while it's not 100% accurate here compared to the original, the general feeling is that it does at least preserve what made the original look great. This specific iteration by Bluepoint was released on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, and it's very similar between the two, with just slightly better performance on Microsoft's console, specifically in the cutscenes, but that's really the only difference here. Both versions run at a native 1280 by 720 with excellent anti-aliasing, and while 720p may seem somewhat subpar by today's standards, the slightly soft look works pretty well here for MGS2, and it's still much cleaner than the original version. The only downside that I noticed while playing are the slightly increased loading times when jumping in and out of codec sequences. It's a minor thing, I suppose, but you'll start to notice it if you spend a lot of time with the original game. And oh, since we're here, why not take a look at a frame rate analysis just for fun? Here's the game running on the PlayStation 3, and you can see that it struggles a little bit in certain scenes like this, but overall it's not bad. And the reason we can look at it here is because, of course, the PlayStation 3 has digital video output, which is not something we could get from the PS2 or the Xbox, so there it is. Overall though, this really is an excellent conversion, and easily one of the best ways to play the game today. There isn't much more to say about it really, it's just a really well made port. But it wasn't the only remastered release. Metal Gear Solid 2 is also available on PlayStation Vita. This time the conversion was handled by Armature rather than Bluepoint itself. Compared to other PlayStation 2 games that have been brought over to the Vita, in hindsight it's actually one of the best ports, but that doesn't mean that it lives up to expectations. You see, this was still early in the Vita's lifetime when it was released, and I had hoped that this version could deliver Metal Gear Solid 2 at native resolution at 60 frames per second, and unfortunately that's not what we got in the end. For one thing, the HD moniker doesn't even really make sense here. The resolution of the game is 720 by 448, which is basically SD. In fact, it has the same line count as the PS2 original 448, but with a wider aspect ratio and the additional corresponding pixels. It looks pretty okay on the Vita screen itself, of course, but when you capture it, it's a real step down from the other versions. And hey, since this is digital video as well, we can check out the performance, and this is where we see the real problem with this port. The frame rate really struggles. Many of the busy scenes, especially outdoors, don't even go for 60 frames per second and instead are locked at 30 frames per second. It's probably wise as opposed to just letting the game run unlocked, but still, it feels like a pretty significant step down when you're used to the game on PlayStation 2. Now once you go indoors, things do improve and you can get to 60 frames per second, but not all the time. In other words, the resolution is just slightly higher than PlayStation 2, but the performance is much worse overall. And I suppose for a handheld it's not really bad, but we really had hoped for better. It's still neat to see MGS2 on a handheld gaming system. Ultimately, Metal Gear Solid 2 is...
I was a North American fall webworm in my past life. Those were the good old days. What were you in your former life?
What?
Don't worry. It's just a video. It's just a video like usual.
Years after its release, MGS2 remains an important piece of gaming history. It helped cement Hideo Kojima as a master creator willing to upend expectations, and helped inspire creators for years to come. And after revisiting it this past week, I was surprised at just how well it holds up. While the controls are cumbersome at points, the gameplay loop remains as engaging as ever, and the level of interaction is still remarkable. Yes, it has its flaws, the codec sequences can drag on too long, and running around the big shell can become tedious at points, but overall this is still a classic experience. And if you want to play it today, there are 3 ways which I could recommend. If you're still using a CRT, such as a Sony PVM, the PS2 version remains my favorite way to play, with visuals perfectly tailored to that type of display. If you're looking for more of an HD experience though, then I'd recommend the HD collection or emulation on the PC. Whichever way you decide to play it today though, it's worth revisiting, and if you've never played it, it's definitely worth checking out for the first time. Will Kojima ever have a chance to pull another Metal Gear Solid 2 then? Well, in his current situation, where he appears to have full creative control and plenty of money, it's entirely possible that Death Stranding could deliver exactly that. We can only hope. And with that, we've reached the end of this very lengthy episode. If you made it this far, now's your chance to vote. Let me know on Twitter or in the comments which generation to look at next. Post codec frequency 140.98 if you want to see a new episode from the Saturn, PlayStation, and N64 era. Frequency 141.00 if you'd rather see another episode from the PS2 and Xbox generation, or frequency 140.95 if you prefer some 16-bit action. Anyways, if you enjoyed this retrospective, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter. I'm always interested in hearing suggestions for future episodes after all, so let me know what you'd like to see. And until next time...
Lolly lule lo. Lolly lule lo. Lolly lule lo.